Welcome to Field Notes from the Dead, where bones whisper, trauma keeps its secrets, and the past refuses to stay silent. I'm Kai Roberts, your host, forensic anthropology student, and dark academia mother of chaos, and someone who truly believes that every human skeleton is like a time capsule. Today's episode is one I've loved for many years. It's an example of just how human, messy, violent, compassionate, and sometimes downright surprising the archaeological record can be. We've talked about medieval monks with a sword wound that he survived long enough for the bone to heal. This isn't fiction, this isn't myth, it's documented physical evidence, and it tells us more about medieval life, violence, brotherhood, and survival than most history books ever will. Let's open this case. When we imagine medieval monks, we tend to picture those quiet illuminated manuscripts, gentle morning prayers, long robes, and shelves of books. But the truth is so much more complex. Monasteries in the medieval period were centers of agriculture, occasional political targets, wealthy storehouses. They were situated in dangerous frontier regions, and they were often staffed by men who had had long lives well before they took their vows. Many monks were former soldiers, former laborers, they were hired guards, and sometimes they were even former raiders before becoming religious men. And monasteries themselves weren't always peaceful. They were attacked during land disputes, feuds, border raids, local conflicts, military campaigns. They weren't Disney monasteries. These were fortified communities in the middle of political chaos. And into this world steps our today's monk. His skull tells us that he survived a violent, sharp force blow, strong enough to slide through the scalp and muscle and into the parietal bone. This wasn't an accident. This was someone swinging a blade with the intent to kill him. All right, let's get into the osteology, or the bone science of this. Sharp force trauma creates very specific signatures, V-shaped cross-sections, because blades are wedge-shaped. They had smooth, curved walls. The sides of the cut are clean and straight, unless the blade itself wasn't straight or it wasn't sharp. And you would see some false starts sometimes. This is where it cuts, but they stop. If the blades slip before the final blow, anything like that. You have radiating fractures. That depends on the force of the angle, but I want you to focus on sharp force trauma, not blunt force trauma. The important part of this, though, in this case, is that the wound healed. The edges were rounded, remodeled, showing evidence of months, possibly up to a year or two, of survival. They were covered with new bone formation. This is the difference between antemortem trauma, which is injuries that have healed, perimortem trauma, which is at or near the time of death, and postmortem damage and or trauma, depending on which book you're reading, which is after death. This is when bone is dry and brittle. Think stick season. You pick it up, it snaps. You can see what I'm going there. This monk's injury is clearly antemortem, meaning he lived through the hit, he received care after the wound was done, he was protected by his community long enough to heal, and he was able to continue some of his duties afterward. That is so significant. In medieval populations, surviving a sword strike to the head was strategically rare. Not because humans were weak, but because they didn't have access to care, and it just wasn't available. This man had people who tended to him. That's part of what makes my heart ache for this case. Trauma always implies violence, but healed trauma implies care. There are a few possibilities, and the archaeology doesn't give us all the answers, but we can outline the most plausible scenarios of who would attack a monk. He was a soldier before he became a monk, so many monastery orders were essentially communities of retired fighters. 2, he was defending the monastery. Monasteries held wealth, they held manuscripts, grain, wine, metals, relics, and were often targets of battle. 3, he was attacked during travel. Very obviously could have happened. Pilgrimage routes were notoriously dangerous, and many monks took them. 4, he could have been caught in a local feud. Medieval politics were messy, super messy, and a lot of times really local. But the detail medievalists emphasize on this is that monks were not passive, at least not always. Some orders carried weapons, some trained novices in combat, some acted as scribes by day and guards at night. Life within a monastery could be a deeply spiritual involvement, but it wasn't always safe. Now, the healing itself is fascinating. Bone healing goes through predictable stages. You've got 1, inflammation, 0 to 1 week, swelling, clotting, pain, but blood supply begins repairing tissue. 2 would be soft callus formation, 2 to 4 weeks about that. Bone begins bridging the wound with collagen and cartilage. Stage 3, which is hard callus, 1 to 2 months after the trauma, actual bone starts to reform. Stage 4, remodeling. Now, this can take months to years depending on several different factors. That's time of place, environment, illness, you name it, it could happen. Our monk, his skull shows remodeling, meaning someone cared for him. He wasn't left to die, he had long-term survival odds, and he lived meaningful after the injury. He actually had a life. He wasn't completely output from his disability. That's where anthropology becomes human. I think what moves me the most about this case in particular, and this sword wound, isn't just evidence of the violence that caused it. It's evidence of who we become after violence. This monk's skull tells a story of a moment of brutality, a long journey of healing, a community that offered care, a life that kept unfolding even after the trauma. We often think of the past as brutal, and yes, it absolutely was brutal, but the show shows tenderness. I think what moves me the most about this case is that a sword wound isn't just evidence of violence. It's evidence of who we become after the violence. This monk, his skull tells a story of a moment of brutality, a long journey of healing, a community that offered care, a life that kept unfolding even after trauma. We often think of the past as brutal, and yes, it was absolutely brutal, but his skull shows tenderness as well, because you don't survive a cranial sword injury without help. Without someone cleaning the wound, without someone making broth, without someone sitting beside you during the fever that could come in the infection, without someone saying, "Stay, don't leave yet." The skeleton becomes a biography of resilience instead of injury. And that is why I love anthropology, because a single healed wound can reveal the entire emotional architecture of a community. That's our case file for today. The monk who survived a blade meant to end him. A man whose bones, centuries later, still testify to our endurance, violence, care, and the complicated humanity of the medieval world. Our next episode, How Bones Talk, Trauma 101 for the morbidly curious. If you enjoyed this candle-lit wander of the archives that I bring, you can follow the podcast, subscribe to our YouTube, or you can send questions to all of my communication things down in the show notes. Stay curious, stay human, and be kind to your bones.